Hope for Anxiety and OCD, episode 32. One thing I've learned about my listeners since we started the podcast is that you all love personal stories of individuals who are struggling with anxiety and OCD. Those are often our most popularly downloaded episodes. So today I have another personal story for you, and that's Jeff Allen. He's a podcaster. I had the opportunity to be on his podcast, which was how we met, and then decided to have him come on and share his story on this podcast. He talks about some backlash that he received in the church when he started to talk publicly about his experience with anxiety and taking medication, as well as some spiritual doubt processes that he worked through. So I hope that you will enjoy this story. Okay, Jeff. So thank you for taking the time to come on today and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. You said my name. It's Jeff. I live near St. Louis, Missouri, actually across the river, the Mississippi River in Illinois. And I'm married for this June will be 11 years. And we just had our first son. And man, life is crazy right now and crazy awesome right now. I work at a church in St. Louis. Yeah. And I do video production, among other tech things here in St. Louis.
So you're the behind the scenes guy making stuff happen.
That's right. Yep. I used to be a worship leader. I kind of needed to step away from that for a while. So now I'm a behind the scenes guy.
Awesome. You are very important, just as the scene people. Okay. Why did you want to come and share your personal story about anxiety on the podcast?
Yeah, I'd love to share it any chance I get because I feel like it's an opportunity to smash some stigmas. I want to take down the stigmas that have been in place by culture, that everyone seems to think that it's such a bad thing to talk about mental health issues. And I want to get away from that. I want people to find freedom. I want people to know they're not alone. So for me, it's important to any opportunity I have to say, I deal with anxiety almost every day and at some level. And sometimes it's worse than, or sometimes it's better than, other times, but anything to help people understand that they're not alone and to just smash stigmas. That's the main reason for me.
I'll say I think that's one of the reasons that the personal stories episodes have been so popular on my podcast is because when people hear someone else talk about the story, they go, oh yeah, me too. I deal with that. And it helps me realize I just thought I was alone and going through all this stuff in my own head and nobody else was dealing with it. But then they hear somebody else talk about it on a podcast and they just feel this sense of relief,
Mm-hmm.
So when did you first start experiencing symptoms of anxiety, even if you didn't necessarily know that that's what it was?
Yeah. Well, I can pinpoint back to as early as like 5 years old. I found a picture on Facebook not too long ago that someone had tagged me in, and it was me as a little kid. They were family friends, this person who posted it. And we were out at this like touristy place locally here in St. Louis called Grant's Farm. And I could see myself standing kind of away from the other group of three kids. They were all hamming it up for the camera. And I was like off to the side, just like always, just kind of like staring like out of like in concern, And I'm thinking, man, I remember that feeling that little boy has right there. I'm like, I know it. I still know it. And I could remember every time we would do something. I'm an only child, so I don't have siblings. So we would always go and hang out with other families. And when we did that, I would be around those kids. And I could always remember telling my mom, man, I really would rather stay home. I don't want to go. Can I please stay home? And she'd say things like, you're going to have a good time. You'll have a lot of fun. And she was right. It always ended up being fun. But the journey to that place was just full of anxiety. I didn't know that's what it was. As a kid, my mom understood probably that she had an anxious kid, but didn't know that it might actually be something that was diagnosable, because that would have been like 1990. And
Right.
I just don't know that very many people were talking about child,
Anxiety
mental
in
health.
children. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure I once saw that the term generalized anxiety disorder, GAD, I once saw that they didn't even have a name for that till 1980. And, don't quote me on that, but I've read that on the internet. So it's got to be true. And if that's the case, then 10 years later, like, why would my mother in the Midwest here know that maybe there's a diagnosable anxiety disorder with her kid?
Right.
So it's been that long. So since 1990, at least, but I can remember up until like the 6th grade, or, just before I started having the choice of who I wanted to go hang out with, it would have been from that point on that I knew that I had anxiety.
What was that process like of coming to a realization of, okay, this is a problem that I may need help for and getting a diagnosis?
Sure. It wasn't until um, 2010, it was the year I got married, that my wife helped me see that this was more than just a character flaw or something. Thank God, actually.
Yeah.
Because I had a few relationships that I think ultimately ended because of my anxiety. Like, I made decisions or treated people a certain way, or maybe felt too much like I was going to lose someone, or didn't trust the relationship over anxiety. And my wife is just very tough, So I think she was able to deal with that and see past some of that better than other people. So it was in 2010. I was leading worship at a mega church in Illinois. I remember being on stage for a rehearsal one week. I thought I was having a heart attack. I'm 25 years old at the time. I'm like, man, this is crazy. I'm heart palpitations. I go to the doctor, or go to the ER. And they're like, no, you're fine. You're fine. Just send me home. So went home. Not long after that, I'm on stage, and I get off stage for the sermon. Our pastor's preaching. And I go up to my colleague and I said, I got to go home. I'm sick. I'm going to throw up. He was able to back me up so that I could leave. And my wife at the time, my wife worked at the same church at that time she was in kids ministry. And I texted her, I said, I'm going home. And then when she met me at home, I said, I feel fine now. And she said, I've been thinking about this, because you've struggled with this for when we go out to eat with couples, you've struggled with feeling sick. Because what if you have an anxiety disorder? And so I was kind of embarrassed because of the stigmas that exist. Man, that's tough. So I decided to ask my general practitioner about it. She said, man, that sure does sound like social anxiety and maybe some general anxiety disorder. Started on Lexapro right there.
What was that like for you when you first heard that? Because you talked about experiencing some stigma, but was it this sense of, here I am in a church leading worship? Did you feel like, well, I shouldn't be struggling with anxiety? Like, I'm supposed to be like more spiritual than that or something?
I did kind of feel that way, but I think it was more like in the back of my mind, really. I didn't really want to tell anybody about it at first, because I just thought that was like a private thing. If you're dealing with some anxiety or depression, I also went to see a counselor at that point. When you go see a counselor, those are things that you just don't talk about. Like, that's private stuff. That's the dirty laundry, or that's the stuff you keep in the closet. So I don't know that I thought I should have been more spiritual necessarily, but I definitely thought it would be looked down upon to come out with it.
It was more like, this
Um,
is embarrassing and I feel ashamed.
yeah, that's right. Mm-hmm.
Mhm. Okay. Okay. And What happened after that? Like, how did that
Yeah.
progress?
So I read there's a blog, now he's a podcaster. He was a worship leader. His name's Carlos Whitaker. I don't know if you know that name or not.
Mm-mm.
Carlos is a great dude. And this was like in the prime of blogs. Everybody used to have a blog and now everybody has a podcast.
We're trendy.
Yes. This was like when blogs were big. And one day I was looking at his blog and there was just this picture of a prescription bottle of Paxil. And he's like, this is the church's dirty little secret. He said he was a worship leader at the time. He told the story of his almost exact same story as mine. He was on at church on Sunday, although he had actually like gotten dizzy and passed out and had to have a doctor come up and he had a full blown anxiety attack on stage. And then he just talked about it like, man, a lot of us in ministry or a lot of people in general, right, have struggles with this. And so I rely on, prayer, God prayer and Paxil. And I'm like, man, that's good. And so I decided I'm going to speak out about this a little bit. So I remember taking to Facebook and saying, man, this blog really hit home with me. And, here's why. And then I got a few few nasty emails from churchgoers. So that left a bad taste in my mouth for church, even though I was still am serving at church, just saying, hey, you're leading people astray. If you're saying that you need medicine, it's bad. And I'm like, man, people, and I think for your listeners, you were on my podcast.
Right.
And I think you said it on there. If you have high blood pressure, nobody ever says you shouldn't take medication for it. If you have this, nobody says but for some reason, church folk like to say that for mental health issues, you should not be taking medication. That doesn't even make sense. So I kind of had that same response to the particular person who said, you need to be relying on Jesus. I'm like, you think I don't already do that? You know me better than that.
Sure.
So it must be enough to to seek help from science and the wonderful things that God had created and for us to manage.
Yeah. I am a firm believer that you can have Jesus and science, Jesus and therapy, and I don't understand why that's such a hard thing sometimes for people to grasp in the church, because we embrace science in all kinds of other ways and other avenues, and we encourage people to get treatment for a variety of illnesses and diseases, and we'll still pray for people too that are going through cancer, but we also want them to go see their oncologist as well. Like it's a both and thing, and the same thing for anxiety. We want to pray for you and encourage you and love on you. And also we want you to get professional help. And those two things can work together. And I just believe God uses everything that's available to us to meet us right where we're at. And some people, medication is a great option for them. Some people have a hard time with medication or finding one that works with their system really well and just want to pursue counseling. And I'm just kind of like, whatever you want to do, I'll support. So it's
I have seasons where I need both. Like I need my medication adjusted or whatever. I have seasons where talk therapy is something that I really need. I have seasons where I don't have much to say. It's always the way to manage for me is that combination,
So you eventually made this decision to kind of leave the on-stage worship ministry experience. Was this a part of that process towards health for you?
Actually, it was in a spiritual way, not necessarily an anxiety way. I was kind of going through like a spiritual deconstruction situation, and I wasn't sure where I was in that walk anymore. And so I really felt uncomfortable leading people when I wasn't so sure myself. And, a lot of people I've talked to have gone through spiritual deconstruction and they never went through reconstruction. And so I was happy that for me, I was able to find the reconstruction aspect and come back and feel like, okay, this is a faith that I am I'm 100% in, right? So, but no, the anxiety portion wasn't, thankfully, wasn't a part of that decision, at least not directly. It's possible that it was somewhere in there, but for the most part, it was a spiritual decision and
Okay.
just maybe even sort of an integrity move. Like I just felt like it wasn't a good thing to kind of almost not believe anymore at that point and still sing and lead people as if I just didn't think it was honest. And so I wanted to be honest. At this point, I would feel comfortable going back to it.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit more about what that spiritual deconstruction and reconstruction looked like for you? Because I'm sure that there are other
Sure.
people listening to this that have doubts and questions and
Yeah.
are going through their own faith process. I know that I had to process my faith has evolved over time as I've become a part of different churches and different streams and faith systems, and having my own experiences with God and the Holy Spirit has definitely shaped things and changed things for me as well. So I'm just curious what that process was like for you.
Well, I mean, it all just kind of started, they always talk about the seed of doubt that's planted, right? And I guess it sort of started with a seed of doubt where I just started to think, is this all just make believe? My buddy was like, "Oh, you just going to pray to your invisible sky daddy?" So
Mm-hmm.
he's somebody who's not a believer, that I'm
Right.
very good friends with. And he would say things like that. And I'm like, I don't know, maybe that is what this is. I need to figure it out. And then there were some things that I don't want to get too in the weeds about, but there are just some things that I'm like, man, I don't know about this. This doesn't seem like a God that would that I don't, it just doesn't feel like the God that I know and that I
Mm-hmm.
experience. There were some early, I grew up in the church, so there was some guilt, shame, things like that were there for me that I don't think were fair. I think they were planted by people and not God.
Sure.
So there was some, like, getting rid of beliefs that were based in those things. And then ultimately it was just saying, I'm going to live in this space of doubt and uncertainty for a while and see where, if God meets me. And I did feel that it was almost like, I'm not going to say it was prodigal son like, because I didn't leave to go pursue something that on purpose, that was not of God. I just needed to find, I think I needed to find God again, and God needed to find me again, is kind of where that was. And now my relationship is just so much different. It just feels more authentic and real, and less, how can I put it? It's just not the culture of Christianity that a lot of us, I'm 36 years old, a lot of us grew up in, anymore.
Right.
It's not that, no making purple at youth group kind of vibe anymore. It's not that these are the harsh rules it's more of the God loves you just as you are. I'm much more, and I'll get pushed back for saying something like this, but I'm much more comfortable living in that space. And it's
Mm-hmm.
not always comfortable, right? That's why I'm saying the pushback. It's not always a comfortable place, but something feels right about it. And so that's just kind of where I'm sitting right now with it.
It's so much easier to have a free flowing and open relationship with God when it's based on love and not terror. And unfortunately, so
Right.
many of us grew up in a Christian society where there are a lot of rules and a lot of religion based things that man put on us, not what God put on us. And so, if you have a relationship based on love, perfect love casts out fear. It's just different. The vibe is totally different. So I relate and jive to what you're saying with that. The rules have to flow out of the relationship, and the guidelines for life have to come, the relationship has to come first. Just like
Mm-hmm.
you have a good relationship with your parents, you don't want to do things that are going to disappoint them. You don't want to be afraid of your parents, like, I'm going to get in trouble all the time.
Right.
It's a very different feel there. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
So you went from not wanting to talk about this, being ashamed of it. And now you have a mental health podcast. So how did that come about?
Well, I was a part of a podcast with my friend. His name is Chris Pondoff. And he had a podcast called Pondoff's Anonymous because he is a recovering alcoholic. And his faith is a very interesting one. He is very close to God. He also has a very dirty mouth. So if you go listen to any of those episodes, we have to mark them explicit. He's just a very honest person. He is who he is and doesn't really apologize for it. But I started producing this podcast for him, just helping with the technical side. In the first podcast, he starts talking to me on the microphone. And I'm like, okay, here we go. I don't have a microphone. So the next episode we did, I made sure I did. And I sort of became a co-host in a sense where he would talk about sobriety and addiction and sobriety. I would talk a little bit about the mental health part of it because I just experienced anxiety. I experienced depression. We ended up kind of talking about both things. So it was supposed to be more of a podcast about addiction and sobriety and recovery, and it ended up being about that and mental health. And we went on a hiatus. We're still on the hiatus. We'll probably end up back sometime this year. Just a lot of life changes that needed, I had a baby, but also he had some major life changes. He had an adoption go through. So he had a kid too.
That's awesome.
So we're on a hiatus. Yeah. So I thought, man, I miss talking about this. And there were some things that, like, when I was first diagnosed, I didn't realize, and maybe this is dumb, but I've heard other people agree with me. I didn't realize that you could go to your general practitioner and they could diagnose you with an anxiety disorder or depression. I just didn't know that.
A lot of people don't know that.
Yeah. So my podcast is called Simple Mental Health. And the whole idea is to break it down as simply as possible. Invite people on to share personal stories, but also invite professionals on. I was so glad to have you on there. You broke down anxiety in maybe the clearest way I've ever heard it broken down before.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, it was perfect. I quote you all the time to friends. So, and that's the whole idea of it. I wanted to do a few episodes just to help people. Maybe they're experiencing, we're still in the end of a pandemic here. Maybe, I guess, they say it is, but we're still in it.
Right.
And so everybody's feeling anxious. It may not be diagnosable, but everybody's having anxiety. And so I guess I wanted a place where people could go and hear people like them. And then people who are, in the professionals who would speak very plainly in layman's terms, about anxiety, depression, maybe in some future episodes, maybe we'll get into some, other things, bipolar, OCD, things like that. So that's really why we started it. It was supposed to be 5 episodes and then I was going to be finished, but we have grown a community online. We have a Facebook group of over 500 people now out of 5 episodes of a podcast, and they are demanding more. So I'm so happy about that. And we're going to do more. So I think I'm just going to do season 1, 5 episodes, season 2, 5 episodes, and go until people stop listening.
That's great. That's awesome. Just something like so small that has grown. And that just shows you that there's a need for it. There are so many people out there struggling with anxiety and depression and OCD, and they're looking for answers. They're looking for what are other people doing, in their day-to-day life with this. How do we manage it together?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I really see that need for sure. I've had a lot of people reach out and just say, like, I didn't even realize that these might be symptoms of anxiety. Just like 20 years of my life, I had no idea that I had anxiety. So I've had people reach out in that way, and I'm really glad.
Yeah. Towards the end of every podcast, I like to ask the guest to share a story of hope, which is a time in which you've received hope from God or another person.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think for me, the hope that I found in God was through that reconstruction that I was talking about earlier. I really found that I began a deconstruction because of the doubt that was placed in my heart, but also because of my childhood upbringing in the church. I grew up in a very conservative church in a very small town, and my understanding there just made for a lot of duty, guilt, obligation style faith. The weird thing is that when I was starting the reconstruction, a lot of the old songs from, being a kid, like when I was a kid, things that we would be, these old Christian songs that people would think are kind of like hokey now, would start coming into my mind. I'm like, I haven't thought about that song in forever. Some old like Rich Mullins songs were popping into my head.
So good.
Yeah.
So good.
Yeah. And then I would just find that I would find this immense comfort in that. And so I feel like, I'm a musician, and in a way I had stopped leading people in worship. And so I kind of just put my guitar down and hadn't picked it up in a while. And I feel like God was meeting me back in that place with music again. God knew that God would find me there. And so my hope was in that. I was starting to reconnect. I connected with a friend at church here, another person on staff here who does not do music as part of their job, but she is a fantastic singer. And we started during the pandemic, we started to record some videos for our online worship at the time. And just we both found our passion for music in ministry specific again. And maybe like even a calling was coming back. So, the hope that I found in that was almost that, like, I called it a reconstruction, but God really reached out and made that happen way more than I did. Like, I didn't so much have to work on that as God found me again.
Mm.
I guess I was in a place where I stopped feeling God's presence or stopped looking for God, and God came calling. So it was that's my place of hope, I think.
Yeah. That like God pursued you.
Yeah. In a way that I had never experienced in all my years of ministry. This is what I did as soon as I got out of high school. Is I went to college for a semester, but then I ended up on a traveling worship team and immediately started working in churches, So my whole life I've been working in ministry, and in a way I never have felt God, call me. I felt God calling me back.
Yeah. That's so great. Now, what I love about that is this sense of God knows how to speak to each one of us individually. Like it's an intimate relationship that we have with him. And so if he was going to meet you, it made sense that he was going to meet you through music. And that was really good.
That's right.
It was a beautiful, kind of beautiful picture, and just a reminder that God's in the details. And I guess I encourage people that if they're going through spiritual struggles like that, to be open, to just remain open to God meeting you where you're at, because God already knows where the condition of our hearts and minds in those dark seasons. I don't remember who the author was, but he kind of called it like this dark night of the soul, where you have these spiritual wrestlings and you're in a place of, sometimes it's sadness or grief or feeling like you've been wounded by God in different ways. Yeah. Thank you for being vulnerable and sharing that.
For sure. Yeah. A thought I was having, with that, with kind of what you just said, and I shared this morning in my Facebook group, is my background is, for most of my life now, has been in Wesleyan theology. I'm Methodist. So that's kind of where John Wesley would have these group meetings, and he would always open up the group meeting with the question, how is it with your soul? And so I asked that question to my group this morning, the Facebook group that I was telling you about. And it was really interesting because it's not a group. My podcast is not a Christian podcast. It's just, but people's worldviews come into play. So if I have a Christian person on, they'll often bring up God. But I told them, I said, how is it with your soul, regardless of your faith? What is it like? I got a lot of not great today. those kind of responses.
Mm-hmm.
I've had some "it is well with my soul" kind of responses, and so I think about that. I think that that's a practice, especially as Christians, that we could start utilizing a little more. Maybe wake up every morning and think, how is it with my soul today? So that's just a random freebie for the day because I was thinking about it today.
No, that's good. That's good. I think just the sense of self-reflection that sometimes we don't take the time to do because either
Yeah.
we're super busy or we're in our heads and we're not in a full bodied experience in our faith. So
Yeah.
it's
And that's one
very
of those
good.
questions it's like the "how are you really" question, right? How is it with your
Mm-hmm.
soul? Man, that's personal. That's deep. That's offensive. And it's beautiful. So
Yeah.
crazy.
Well, it's been great having you on to share your story and how this has impacted your faith and your faith wrestlings and all of that. It's been really amazing. And check out the Simple Mental Health podcast. And I'm on episode 1 if you want to check it out. So,
Yes. Check it out. She's amazing. Thank you for having me.
as always, we will put all the links in the show notes for you to Jeff's podcast as well as the specific episode that I was on. If you have a personal story of anxiety or OCD that you might like to share, please feel free to contact me anytime through our website, www.hopeforanxietyandocd.com. I am currently looking for someone who has overcome a phobia who would like to tell their story. I would also love to talk with someone who has worked through some social anxiety and how they processed that. So, if you have personal stories in either of those areas, or maybe you know someone who might be willing to tell their story, please have them contact me. Thank you so much for listening. Hope for Anxiety and OCD is a production of By the Well Counseling in Smyrna, Tennessee. Our original music is by Brandon Mangrum, and audio editing is completed by Benjamin Bynum. Until next time, may you be comforted by God's great love for you.